I should maybe add a little bit more. We're concentrating on food, but what about the genes, like human genes, being used in pigs, make the pigs grow larger? And so that's a whole new area that people don't realize, or spider genes being used in goats to produce milk that can be processed to make very strong steel from. So all those sort of things are going on. Or in breast cancer treatment, two of those genes that are used in breast cancer treatment are owned by a corporation in Salt Lake City, Utah, and before they can be used, you have to pay a license fee to be able to use that breast cancer treatment. And if you want to do any more research on that, results of that treatment, you have to pay another license fee to that company. So it's not only food or plants, it has spread into all of our society and every avenue of life. So it goes, I don't want to go in that whole area, but it doesn't only stop with seeds or plants.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on justice, and of course we don't have justice, we have law. But I wanted to ask you, has the contracts they're asking the farmers to sign, they've been taken to our Human Rights Commission? Because they're asking you to sign away all your human rights. Has it gone that way?
I'm not sure on that, whether those contracts have been taken there. We didn't take them when we went there to human rights in Geneva. We went and I mentioned some of the items, what we presented. But I know that all those contracts, I would be sure they're in a gray area. And actually, before a farmer signs a contract, I think if it came down to it, it could be challenged that he should have had legal counsel in regards to what he was signing.
Percy, you made the comment that former RCMP officers do the on-farm investigation, and
well, the former.
Right, and I understand that, but my question is that when that evidence comes to court then, how would a police officer be treated as an expert witness in a case of biology? So if you could speak to how the court...
Well, first of all, the former police officers that they hired, in fact, I can give you, there were 35 hired last year in Saskatoon, former RCMP. And what they do, they just investigate, they get samples and do something like that. Or go on the farmer's land or go out to a farmer's home, as I said, in regards to complaints, not complaints, but information that they have received. But one thing that I would like to say, which really bothers me, is that when they go to a home, and mostly all the farmers that have told me after those visits, they said, one of the first things they say to a farmer, we're former RCMP officers. So they try and use their former position as an officer to try and put fear into the farmer. And that's definitely against the law.
That's bullying, man.
Well, I also have about 20 questions I could ask you, but I'll stick to one. One quick comment. I guess most of the industrial meat that we buy now would be considered GMO because most of the feed that animals are fed contains GMO grains. So I would take it most is, right?
Well, technically speaking, it's not GMO meat because, or there is a whole other project which would be to genetically modify animals. So the animals themselves are not genetically modified, but in most of the corn and soy grown in the US, Canada, and Argentina that's genetically modified goes to livestock feed and processed food ingredients. And so it's something that is often missing from our calculation of what we're eating that's genetically modified is when we're eating meat that's not organic or dairy products that are not organic.
How does a farmer who has already signed one contract or has already grown one crop that is GM, how did they really get out of that? Can they just say to Monsanto, that's it, I'm not growing that anymore? And
once you grow a GMO crop, it's pretty well over because you always have volunteers that will appear. And canola is one of the worst crops because the canola seed is an oil-based seed and can lie dormant, they say, up to, no problem, up to 10, 15 years in your soil. So if you think you have eliminated the contamination, and then it can reappear if soil conditions are right, climatic conditions are right. So basically, once you go into it, it's over. And Monsanto knows that, because I'll tell you what happens, is that if a farmer buys GMO canola seed 1 year, and he doesn't like it, and he decides to go see a conventional canola, which is impossible now to get it, but he decides to grow a conventional canola. Monsanto knows that there are going to be GMOs in his field, so they'll go out, and I had a case not far from our place where a farmer grew 750 acres the following year of different type canola, and they came after him and they said, you know there's going to be volunteers in your crop, and why didn't you grow our seed? And he said, I didn't like it. They tried to get $40,000 or $50,000 from him. Because once you're on a treadmill, once you grow it, it's over. Because of the volunteers, and like I said, canola is one of the worst crops for volunteers. You could have 20%.
My question is for Percy. You had spoken about decreased yields in canola after the first couple of years, and also about increased dependence on chemicals. Could you just flesh that out a little bit and tell us why?
Well, I think what happened, Monsanto, when they came out with GMOs in canola, they buy a pyre seed because they never invented canola, and that was West Star. And West Star variety was one of the poorest varieties you could ever use because farmers were not using it anymore, so you had a decrease there. But you have to remember, GMOs were never meant for yield increase. It was meant to keep a plant from dying if you sprayed a chemical on. So it had nothing to do with yield, and it had nothing to do with more nutritious. It was just a gimmick by the corporations to get farmers to use it. So the latest figures I have, it's a little over 8%. But now they have hybrids, so.
And what about the increased chemical dependency?
Yeah, that came account of the super weeds. I'll give you an example what happened on the prairies a lot, especially in Saskatchewan and Alberta this year, is that we had a very dry spring, a very cold spring, and crops really germinated at 2 or 3 different periods of time when we started getting rain. So farmers actually sprayed their canola fields 3 times this spring who used GMO canola. And you had the first flush, they sprayed, had weeds, and then it got rain, and the second flush, and the chemical dealers, some of them are my friends, not all of them, but they've told me they've sold many farmers 3 times chemicals this year. So you can see the increase. If you look, I think Lucy could tell you, if you look at the pounds of chemical increase in the last 2 or 3 years, it's amazing.
Okay, the 2,4-D, is that actually allowed to be put on crops for human consumption nowadays?
2,4-D is allowed I don't know about Alberta, but it's allowed in Saskatchewan. And they said many countries have taken it off the market. We could not find out in Canada what the active ingredients were in 2,4-D ester. We had to go to Germany to get it.
And that's with the Agent Orange.
Yeah, and that's where we found out at least was 70% Agent Orange. We could never get from the Food Inspection Agency. See, you have to remember, Canada, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lucy, Canada will only test the active ingredient. But if you take 2 or 3 chemicals and mix it together, they don't test it. But what happens is, like if you take a drug, it might be safe, but if you take it in conjunction with another drug, it might become very deadly or toxic. And that's what's wrong with our chemicals. We don't have the testing of the combined chemicals. But the Germans did it for us.
Being proactive.
Yeah,
This isn't quite an answer to that in terms of strategy, because, I mean, in many ways, corporations, you know, they don't have a long-term strategy because they don't need to. They're just going to sell, you know, Roundup-ready crops that are resistant to Roundup, and when there's too many Roundup-resistant weeds, well, maybe they'll be able to come up with a better pesticide, you know, and they have this idea that they'll solve whatever kind of problem they create with a new technology, and they have such a purchase on industrial agriculture